There's a question I can almost guarantee you've never dared to ask out loud. What if the life you're living right now isn't actually your real life? I'm not talking about science fiction. I'm talking about something happening right now to billions of people on this planet, and possibly to you too. Most of us are trapped in a very deep sleep without even realizing it. We wake up, eat breakfast, go to work, scroll through our phones, go to sleep, and repeat the exact same cycle the next day. And we call that living. But in reality, it may only be a loop that society has programmed into us since we were children. Psychologists, spiritual teachers, and even people who have gone through the most life-changing transformations all seem to agree on one thing. Human beings can awaken through different levels of consciousness. And most of humanity never makes it past the very first level. Not because they aren't intelligent enough, not because they aren't lucky enough, but simply because no one ever showed them that something much deeper exists beneath the surface of ordinary life. In today's video, I'm going to take you through the 7 levels of spiritual awakening that most people never reach. And I promise you this, by the time this video ends, you will never look at yourself the same way again. Level 1, the sleeper. Let me tell you about a man named Jackson. He was 32 years old, had a stable job, a small apartment in the city, and spent weekends having coffee with friends once in a while. From the outside, Jackson's life looked completely normal, even better than most people's. But there was something strange that even he couldn't explain. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit alone and stare out the window, feeling a quiet emptiness creeping into his chest. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't exactly boredom either. It was just a vague feeling that somehow he was missing something incredibly important without knowing what it was. Have you ever felt that way? If you have, then you are standing at the edge of the first level. And if you never have, if your life simply moves along day after day and you feel perfectly fine with it, then there's a good chance you are already deep inside this level without realizing it. The first level has a very direct name, the sleeper. People at this level are not bad people. They are not stupid or lazy. They are simply living according to a script someone else wrote for them. Since childhood, we are taught to study hard so we can get a good job so we can make money so we can buy a house, buy a car, start a family, have children, and then teach those children to repeat the exact same cycle. The circle keeps spinning from one generation to the next, and almost nobody stops to ask the simplest question of all: why? The sleeper never asks that question, not because they are incapable of asking it, but because the system around them is designed to make sure they never have the time or space to do so. Social media constantly floods their attention. Work consumes the daytime. Entertainment fills the evenings. And when the mind is always busy, people stop hearing the tiny whisper inside themselves. The whisper trying to tell them that something about the way we are living is deeply wrong. The most frightening thing about this level is not that people are suffering. In fact, many people at this stage look very happy from the outside. They smile, they travel, they post photos online. But it is the kind of happiness you feel while watching a great movie, a happiness completely dependent on external things. And the moment those things disappear, the happiness disappears with them. That is exactly what happened to Jackson one night in March, when he received news that his company was cutting staff, and his name was on the list. It was only a small shock, but enough to crack the peaceful shell he had spent years building around himself. And sometimes, those cracks become the best thing that can ever happen to a person. Because only when the shell breaks open can the light finally enter. And that is where level 2 begins. Level 2, the seeker. After the night he lost his job, Jackson began doing something he had never done before. He started reading books. Not books about making money or climbing the career ladder. He began reading the kinds of books he used to walk past in bookstores, the ones he always ignored because they seemed too abstract or unrealistic. He read about the meaning of life, psychology, and people who had lost everything only to rediscover themselves. And for the first time in years, he felt truly alive. Even though from the outside, his life looked harder than ever. Jackson had entered level 2. He had become a seeker. A seeker is someone who has begun hearing the call within themselves. They can no longer pretend that everything is fine. Something has shifted in the way they see the world, even if they cannot fully explain what it is yet. They only know that their old way of living is no longer enough to fill the emptiness inside them, and they need to find something deeper. What's interesting is that this level rarely begins in peaceful moments. It usually begins with pain. Some people lose the person they love most and suddenly realize they never truly understood what life was. Some go through a devastating breakup and for the first time sit down and ask themselves what they actually want from life. Others are like Jackson, just one small shock at work, but enough to crack open all the questions that had been buried underneath for years. People at the seeker stage often share one very recognizable trait. They begin to feel different from everyone around them. They sit at lively parties yet feel strangely alone inside. Conversations about house prices or office gossip no longer interest them. They want to talk about things with deeper meaning, but they don't know who to talk to. And sometimes they wonder if they are becoming strange. But they are not strange. They are waking up. Still, this level comes with a dangerous trap that many people fall into without realizing it. The trap is searching endlessly without ever stopping to practice. They move from one book to another, one video to the next, one course after another. They collect knowledge the same way people collect possessions. And after a while, the bookshelf inside their mind becomes completely full, while their heart remains just as empty as before. This is what people call spiritual bypassing, using spiritual seeking as a way to avoid truly facing yourself. Jackson fell into that trap too. By the time he reached his 15th book, he suddenly realized he was reading just to feel like he was making progress, not to truly change. And once he understood that, he stopped. He closed the book, sat quietly in silence, and for the first time in his life, he simply sat there without doing anything at all. And in that moment of silence, something began to happen that he had no words to describe. That was the beginning of level 3. And this is the level where everything truly starts to change. Level 3, the awakening. Jackson sat there in silence for about 15 minutes. No phone, no music, no books, just the sound of traffic drifting up from the street below and the rhythm of his own breathing. At first, he felt restless. His hand kept wanting to reach for his phone, but he forced himself to stay still. Then, at a moment he could never clearly identify, something very strange happened. He realized that he was observing his thoughts, not being pulled around by them like always, but watching them from a distance as they drifted by like clouds. And in that moment, he understood something that none of the books he had read could truly teach him. Those thoughts were not him. The thing observing those thoughts was the real him. It sounds simple, but for Jackson, it was one of the most shocking moments of his life. This is level 3, the awakening. Awakening is not a religious idea or something that only happens to monks living on mountaintops. It is a deeply human experience, and modern neuroscience has begun studying and documenting it over the past few decades. People who have gone through awakening describe it in different ways, but almost all of them share one thing in common. They suddenly see reality more clearly, as if a thin veil that had covered their eyes for years has finally been lifted. Some people experience this after years of meditation. Others experience it suddenly in the middle of an ordinary morning while washing dishes or driving down a highway. The poet Walt Whitman once described his awakening as happening during a walk in the park, when he suddenly felt himself becoming one with the trees, the sky, and everything around him. He did not know what to call it. He only knew that after that moment, he was no longer the same person. The awakening level brings three major realizations that most people never truly reach. The first realization is that the ego is not who you are. Your name, your career, the personality you think belongs to you, all of those things are only the outer show. Beneath them is something deeper, quieter, and impossible to destroy, no matter what happens in life. The second realization is that the present moment is the only thing that is truly real. The past is memory, and the future is imagination. The only moment you are actually living is this one, right now. And the third realization is that everything is connected in a way the ordinary mind cannot fully understand, only feel. But here is what almost nobody tells you about awakening. It is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a far more difficult stage. Because once you have seen the truth, you can never pretend you have not seen it. And your old life will begin to collapse, piece by piece. Spiritual teachers call the next stage the dark night of the soul. And it is far darker than most people imagine. Level 4, the dark night of the soul. There is a paradox that most people entering the spiritual journey are never warned about. The more awakened you become, the more pain you may feel. Not because you are on the wrong path, but precisely because you are finally on the right one. After his moment of awakening, Jackson believed things would become easier. He thought he had found the key, and that life would now open before him like a giant door finally thrown wide open. But reality was completely different. In the weeks that followed, Jackson began to feel something heavier and darker than anything he had ever experienced before. It was not depression in the ordinary sense. It felt more like everything he had once believed in, clung to, and used to define himself was melting away, and nothing was there to replace it. He no longer knew who he was. The phrase, the dark night of the soul, was first introduced by a Spanish monk named Saint John of the Cross in the 16th century. He used the image of deep darkness in the middle of the night to describe the stage where a person has let go of their old life, but has not yet found a new one. It is neither hell nor heaven, but the empty space in between. And according to him, it is the deepest and most important purification process in the entire spiritual journey of a human being. What makes this stage so unbearable is that it attacks everything at once. Relationships you once believed were meaningful suddenly feel distant. Work that once seemed important now feels empty. Beliefs you carried for years begin to shake and collapse. And most frightening of all, the self you thought you understood better than anything else suddenly becomes the most unfamiliar thing in your life. Many people at this stage try to escape by returning to their old lives. They rush into new relationships to fill the emptiness. They bury themselves in work so they do not have to think. They turn to alcohol, social media, or anything that can numb the hollow feeling eating away inside them. And honestly, that reaction is completely understandable because the dark night of the soul is not something ordinary people are ever taught how to face. But those who choose to sit still with it, those who allow the darkness to surround them without running away, eventually discover something extraordinary. Beneath everything that is collapsing, there is something that remains standing, something untouched even when everything outside falls apart. And when you finally recognize that thing, when you truly come into contact with it, you understand why this painful stage is called purification rather than destruction. Jackson sat with his darkness for 3 months. No answers, no light at the end of the tunnel, only silence and a fragile belief that this was not the end. Then one morning in June, while drinking coffee and staring out at the small courtyard in front of his apartment, he realized something had changed. He was no longer fighting. He had let go. And that was the moment Level 5 began welcoming him with an entirely different kind of light. Level 5, the surrender. There is something modern culture teaches us from a very early age, and it becomes so deeply rooted in our minds that it almost feels impossible to remove. Never give up. Keep pushing. Keep fighting. Go beyond your limits. Never fall down. These slogans are printed on t-shirts, hung on office walls, and shouted through motivational videos with millions of views. And in some situations, they are absolutely right. But there is one thing those slogans never tell you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not to keep fighting, but to let go. That morning, as Jackson sat staring into the small courtyard outside his apartment, he did not make some grand decision. There was no dramatic moment, no blinding light shining down from the sky. He simply sat there, holding a cup of cold coffee, and realized he was exhausted. Exhausted from trying to control everything. Exhausted from worrying about the future. Exhausted from constantly asking why life had turned out this way. And in that exhaustion, he simply stopped. Stopped forcing. Stopped resisting. Stopped asking. And strangely enough, the moment he let go, he felt lighter than he had in years. Surrender is the level that most people misunderstand the most. When people hear the words letting go, they often imagine someone passive, unmotivated, someone who simply gives up on life. But that is not what surrender truly means. Surrender does not mean you stop doing anything. It means you stop attaching yourself to the outcome. You still act, still try, still love, still work with all your heart, but your happiness is no longer chained to whether life unfolds exactly the way you planned. The Japanese have a concept called mono no aware, which can roughly be translated as the bittersweet awareness of impermanence. It is the ability to see beauty in something because it will fade away, not despite the fact that it will fade away. Cherry blossoms are beautiful not even though they bloom for only 1 week, but because they bloom for only 1 week. And people who reach the level of surrender begin to see life in a similar way. They no longer try to hold on to beautiful moments, nor do they try to push difficult moments away. They allow everything to pass through them. And within that passing, they discover a kind of peace that no amount of money or success can ever buy. But it is important to tell you the truth about this stage. Surrender does not arrive once and stay forever. Jackson learned this too. There were days when he forgot everything, days when he started worrying again, trying to control everything again, resisting reality once more. And each time he had to return to that quiet morning in June and remind himself that letting go is not a single act. It is a daily practice, sometimes even an hourly one. A monk once said that surrender is not giving up, but accepting. Accepting that life is bigger than our plans. Accepting that some things will always remain outside our control, and that this is completely okay. Accepting that the river of life has its own direction, and sometimes the wisest thing we can do is allow ourselves to float with the current instead of exhausting ourselves trying to swim against it. And when Jackson finally understood that, something interesting began to happen. His life did not become perfect, but he started noticing beauty in the smallest things he had ignored for years. The sound of rain tapping against the roof, the smell of coffee in the morning, the smile of a stranger passing by on the street. These things had always been there, but he had never truly seen them because his mind was always racing toward the future or looking back at the past. And that was the first sign that level 6 was beginning to reveal itself. Level 6, the integration. There is a misconception that many people on the spiritual path fall into, and it can cause them to waste years of their lives without realizing it. It is the belief that in order to live a spiritual life, you must separate yourself from the ordinary world. You must meditate for hours every day. You must become strictly vegan. You must escape the noise and chaos of city life. You must climb a mountain, enter a monastery, or at the very least create a quiet meditation corner filled with incense and yoga mats. Level 6 completely shatters that illusion. About 6 months after that morning in June, Jackson found a new job. It was not his dream job, just an ordinary position at a medium-sized company. He still had to wake up early, still dealt with demanding bosses, still sat in traffic during rush hour, still handled small conflicts with coworkers. From the outside, his life looked almost exactly the same as before. But something had changed completely, something invisible to everyone else, the way he showed up inside those moments. When washing dishes after dinner, his mind no longer drifted toward tomorrow's work. He simply washed the dishes, feeling the warm water against his hands, hearing the soft clinking of plates, and realizing that was enough. When listening to a coworker speak, he no longer listened while secretly preparing his own response in his head. He simply listened, truly listened, and discovered that genuine attention might be one of the greatest gifts a person can give another human being. This is the true nature of integration. Not escaping ordinary life, but bringing awakening into every ordinary moment within it. The poet and meditation teacher Jack Kornfield once wrote, "After the ecstasy, chop wood and carry water." The sentence sounds simple, but it contains the entire philosophy of this stage. Enlightenment does not lift you onto some cloud above earthly life. It returns you to earthly life with completely different eyes. You still chop wood, you still carry water, but in every swing of the axe and every step you take, you are so fully present that the boundary between the doer and the action almost disappears. People at the level of integration no longer divide life into spiritual and ordinary parts. For them, a morning meditation and an afternoon business meeting can be equally sacred, as long as they are fully present in both. A family dinner and a religious ceremony can hold the same depth, as long as their heart remains open within each experience. What became interesting was that the people around Jackson started sensing the change, even though they could not explain it. They said talking to him felt different now, calmer, more genuine. They did not know why. They only knew they enjoyed being around him more. And Jackson never tried to explain it, because some things do not need explanations. They only need to be lived. Integration is not the final destination, but for most human beings, it is the highest level they can truly reach and sustain in everyday life. Level 7 is different. It is not something you achieve through effort. It is something that happens to you when you are finally ready to let go of the very last thing remaining. And that final thing is yourself. Level 7, Enlightenment. I want to be honest with you from the very beginning of this section. Enlightenment is the hardest part of this entire 7-level journey to describe. Not because it is mystical or distant, but because its true nature exists beyond the limits of language itself. All I can really do is point toward the moon. Whether you actually see the moon or not, that part belongs to you. Throughout human history, only a small number of people are believed to have truly and completely reached this level. Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, sat beneath the Bodhi tree, and after 49 days of continuous meditation, he attained what Sanskrit calls nirvana, the extinguishing of suffering and attachment. Ramana Maharshi, an Indian sage who lived in the early 20th century, experienced enlightenment at the age of 16 after a sudden and overwhelming fear of death. He sat down and turned his awareness inward with one question: who am I? And in that moment, the self he had always believed himself to be completely dissolved. What remained, according to him, was a pure presence, silent and boundless beyond all borders. So what is enlightenment, really? If we must use language to describe it, then this is what most great spiritual traditions seem to agree upon. Enlightenment is the state in which the boundary between the self and the universe completely disappears. Not in the sense that you stop existing, but in the sense that the illusion of being a separate self, apart from everything else, is fully seen through and no longer creates suffering. An enlightened person still eats, still sleeps, still speaks, still feels pain and joy. But there is no longer anyone inside clinging to pleasure or running away from pain. Everything simply happens, and is witnessed in complete peace. It is important to make one thing clear. Enlightenment is not a permanent state of happiness in the ordinary sense. The Buddha still grew old, became sick, and eventually died. Ramana Maharshi developed cancer near the end of his life and experienced very real physical pain. Yet both were said to remain inwardly undisturbed by these things. Because enlightenment does not change external circumstances. It changes the one experiencing those circumstances, or more accurately, it dissolves the illusion that there was ever a separate someone experiencing them in the first place. And what about Jackson? I will not say that Jackson became enlightened because that would not be honest. His journey is still continuing, just like the journey of most of us. But one afternoon, while sitting in a park near his apartment, he watched a child running after soap bubbles floating through the air. And for one brief moment, he felt no boundary between himself and the child, between himself and the bubbles, between himself and the golden sky glowing behind them. Just for an instant. Then it passed. But he knew what he had touched was real. And perhaps that is the only thing we truly need to know about enlightenment. Not how to achieve it, but simply that it exists. That beneath all the noise, anxiety, ambition, and fear of everyday life, there is something quiet and vast waiting to be recognized. It is not far away. It has never left you. And this 7-level journey, in the end, is not really about finding something new. It is about returning to what you already were before you forgot.